All right, everybody, thanks for joining today. We're going to go ahead and let our audience continue to populate, but I'll go ahead and offer our introduction. My name is Lisa Schroeder. I'm the chair of the WIT Trust, as well as the Global Director of Trade Policy for Dow. Most importantly, I'm just really thrilled to be having this conversation this morning about opportunities around CPTPP. I think for our WIT audience, this is always going to be a fascinating conversation. And we have to thank Sarah Salinas, our WIT, to think for a minute, Fall 2021 scholarship winner, who did her entire essay around US entry back into CPTPP and really looking at those opportunities. Great topic, and it demonstrates Sarah's great scholarship when it comes to building a career around international trade, and for purposes of this call, particularly those development opportunities. We're really thrilled that WIT Trust and our scholarship program can continue to encourage, sponsor, and engage with amazing young leaders like Sarah, who are going to continue to drive a very active trade policy agenda as we go into what is hopefully going to be the post-COVID world and our global economic recovery. It creates a great opportunity for us to not only celebrate Sarah's win and joining, being part of the WIT community now as one of our young scholarship winners, but also the opportunity to bring together some great leaders to talk about what CPTPP really means and where we can go from here, something the WIT community has always been very active in. But I am thrilled to give an opportunity for Sarah to introduce herself to everybody and reflect on her interest in international trade. Sarah?
Hello, everyone. First and foremost, thank you for having me here today. It's absolutely incredible to have something that you've written about become a panel. It really comes full circle. And as someone who's in a third year in their MA JD program at American University, bringing my legal and policy side interests together, especially relating back to trade, I think it's really important, especially when it comes talking about this topic. From this discussion today, I hope that we can have a fruitful conversation about the role CPTPP has and the impact, especially in the labor force, but also the opportunities it has for growth and really looking at what comes in the future. In particular, examining the United States' future, or perhaps lack of future in the CPTPP, but also the benefits it has to as the global international body as a whole. And so I'm really excited to have this discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm Nithya Nagarajan, partner at Hush Blackwell, and I'll be the moderator today. So let's get the substance of the panel started. Just as a brief overview, the CPTPP, or the long name of it, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, is basically a free trade agreement between 11 countries: Australia, Brunei, Dar es Salaam, Canada, Chile, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, New Zealand, Peru, Singapore, and Vietnam. All 11 of these countries are members of APEC, and the CPTPP was concluded on January 23rd, 2018 in Tokyo, Japan, and then signed on March 8th, 2018 in Chile. Singapore ratified it on July 19, 2018, and became the third nation to do so after Mexico and Japan. And after that, we're in the current state where there has been no further progress. So that's kind of the focus and of this panel, to say where CPTPP is going to go in the future and how it's going to affect global trade. So without further ado, let me introduce our three panelists today. There'll be Wendy Cutler of the Asia Society Policy Institute, Orit Frankel of the American Leadership Institute, and Nidya Nigau, the Managing Director in Singapore of the Bauer Group Asia. So please, to the audience, if you have questions, please use the Q&A function, and we will definitely address your question once the panelists finish giving their presentations. Thank you. The order is, sorry, Wendy, you're up first.
Well, thank you very much. It's my real honor to be here, and congratulations to Sarah Salinas. Great to hear that your essay won. I think you should be proud of that. And we're proud to join you to discuss an important topic. The CPTPP, as mentioned, it's been in effect now for about 5 years. Between, I guess at this point, 8 CPTPP members, 3 still have not ratified. And I think if you ask those 8 countries, has the CPTPP benefited them? I think their answer would be a resounding yes. They have achieved market access benefits among them. And I would note that each year, new tariff cuts come into effect as the phase-in periods of tariff reduction and tariff elimination kick in. US products become less competitive. And I'm sure we'll get to that. What does this all mean for the US? So they're enjoying more access to each other's market. I would argue during a time of supply chain disruption and vulnerabilities, their economies are integrating further, and they can probably rely on each other to a larger degree being part of this agreement. And frankly, they're also, they have common rules. Just this past week, the senior officials met and we're already talking about updating some of these rules. And so it's a great pact. It's unfortunate we left. I would just put on the table that if we were going to rejoin, I'm of the belief the current CPTPP will not cut it. It's not a question of just unsuspending the 22 provisions that were suspended when we left. In fact, I'm not even sure we would even want some of those provisions reinserted. It would have to look different. It would have to be more responsive to technological differences, to our worker-centric trade policy, and just overall developments, in the international and regional trade landscape. So with that, I'll turn it to others.
Good. Orit, would you like to take the next lead? You're on mute, sorry.
Thank you so much. Thank you again to Sarah for your wonderful essay, and to Lisa and the WIT team for arranging this opportunity. So I think, as Wendy has already mentioned, when all the countries ratify, it's going to be a massive, massive market with really unprecedented. I'm going to focus on, by the way, the challenge for workers, challenge and opportunities for workers in the region. And I'm going to look at the digital, particularly vis-a-vis the digital chapter, and also looking at the potential impact of the U.S. Indo-Pacific economic framework that the U.S. is embarking on with many of the same countries. So, once all the countries ratify, it's going to, it will be a huge, I think, massive market with really unprecedented opportunities and challenges for the workers in the region. On the digital front, while many of the CPTPP countries belong to digital agreements that are more comprehensive, like USMCA or DIPA, the agreement between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand, or the DEA between Australia and Singapore, the CPTPP agreement, on the one hand, is unique because I think it's the first to have a digital provision in such a broad and diverse group of countries, but the level of the provisions is relatively basic. So for workers and small businesses in those countries to really reap the benefits, those countries really need to focus on inclusion and access to digital technologies and training. In the US, we've been calling this approach worker-centric. So the first element is really ensuring that all citizens have equal access to broadband, digital technologies, and training. This is also really going to help small businesses. These countries, like the US, have very deep digital divides. which hit underserved communities particularly hard. New Zealand, for instance, has an approach called Trade for All, which focuses, among other things, on ensuring that the Maoris equally benefit. And DEPA actually has specific commitments for its signatories, both on digital inclusion and ensuring access for SMEs. So this is particularly important for the lower income partners in the agreement. And the more developed countries should think about offering technical assistance or training to help those countries overcome the hurdles. So in terms of small businesses, I think, one thing we're dealing with now in the US is that trade agreements are complex, and the CPTPP countries should make sure that the digital agreements are accessible to SMEs in all sorts of ways. So the US is launching negotiations for its new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. At least that's what I'm calling it. I don't know if anyone else is using that acronym yet, which is really going to include a lot of the CPTPP countries. And so while the details aren't yet fully developed, the digital part of the IPEF will likely be much more comprehensive than those in CPTPP. So as I mentioned, some of the developed countries in CPTPP are already partners to more comprehensive agreements, but many are not. So I think many of these countries, especially in ASEAN, will be discussing more comprehensive standards with the US as part of IPEF. And I think that raises a lot of interesting questions as to whether over time, this could really provide incentives to raise some of the commitments in digital across CPTPP and other areas. So anyway, I think number one, CPTPP should really look at how to provide access and inclusion for its workers, and two, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how IPEF impacts the dynamics of CPTPP.
Thank you very much, Harriet. Nydia, we'll turn it over to you for your remarks now.
Thank you. So good morning, and thank you again to Lisa and the WIT Trust for organizing this panel. And of course, congratulations to Sarah for her award-winning essay. I'm truly honored to be able to join you today to share the ASEAN's perspective on CPTPP, which I believe is an agreement that is near and dear to all of us here. The benefits of the agreement, I think, are well known to all, so I won't go into too much detail there. And focus a bit more on how it has impacted or how ASEAN looks at it, or share the ASEAN perspective. So in that regard, I think, the CPTPP currently only has 2 ASEAN member states that have ratified the agreement, even though there were 4 of us that signed the agreement. So Vietnam and Singapore are the only 2 that has ratified the agreement thus far. And I think the numbers speak for themselves. Especially when you look at the numbers for Vietnam, they ratified and implemented the agreement in January 2019. And to date, the agreement has significantly increased exports by 8% to CPTPP markets, especially to Canada and Mexico, which are the 2 new FTA markets for them. Reports released by the Ministry of Industry and Trade showed that export turnover of Vietnamese goods to these member countries reached the $8.7 billion. And more importantly, Vietnam's participation has really helped the country attract more foreign direct investment, with FDI investment from CPTPP member countries hitting $11.6 billion US, up 23.4% compared to 2019. Looking at Singapore, the government has always strongly believed that the CPTPP was more than just a trade agreement. The government always viewed it as a strategically important one. And as someone who was from the Singapore government and who had negotiated the agreement for Singapore, I do beg your forgiveness if I sometimes lapse into the we, because I still think that way from time to time. But in terms of the agreement for Singapore, it basically eliminated tariffs for 94% of Singapore's exports to CPTPP markets. And I think, for Singapore, what was important is that it tackled trade issues that were relevant to the 21st century economy by establishing enforceable rules in e-commerce and in IP, particularly as it relates to the investment climate, which is what I'm supposed to talk about. I think there has been preferential treatment for investors through various obligations. And I think the CPTPP, as well as other FTA investment chapters, do provide a predictable operating environment, locking in a minimum standard of treatment, minimum level of market access for investors. And this actually serves as an insurance policy to deter trading partners from changing their laws to becoming more restrictive, even when government regimes change. And of course, what is important and unfortunately has become fairly polarized is allowing recourse through investor state dispute settlement, or ISDS. And I think, Sarah actually devoted an entire section to this in her paper, noting how President Biden had come out against ISDS during his campaign for presidency, but also pointing out in her paper that the US has never lost an ISDS case under the NAFTA, which I found to be very interesting. And as we look towards opportunities to grow investment and how countries can stay competitive in today's market, I think that the discussion on ISDS can be a polarizing one. When we look at the Asia Pacific, there is no denying that FDI is important for economic development, and countries in Asia have, modernized their laws and policies governing foreign investment in a bid to attract more FDI. And Singapore in particular recognized this almost immediately upon our independence in 1965. We signed our first bilateral investment treaty with the US in 1966, and then more followed subsequently. And this clearly paid off for Singapore because the US FDI in Singapore is in multiples of what the US actually invests in China, India, Japan, and Korea. But I think, as more investment treaty claims were starting to be made against countries in Asia, that's when, countries started becoming more wary of ISDS, and which I think is a little bit short-sighted because countries in the region have started exporting capital as well. And so I think it's important to recognize that having such provisions not only look towards attracting FDI into the various respective markets that are party to the agreement, but also protects overseas investments of countries' nationals as their outbound FDI increases as well. So I may have drunk the Kool-Aid on this one, but I echo Singapore's belief that the ISDS mechanism actually serves to enforce commitments entered into by governments under bilateral investment treaties, FTAs, and depoliticizes investment disputes. So, as we look towards future growth, I think one of the things that we need to look is to perhaps look towards those in ASEAN who are part of the CPTPP but have not yet started to ratify or have not yet ratified the agreement, and look to how we can address those concerns, ISDS, of course, being one of them. And I think already we see growing calls from the industry for Malaysia to ratify the agreement. The Federation of Malaysian Manufacturers, for instance, have called out how more than 90% of Malaysia's export interests will benefit from duty-free treatment in the CPTPP countries. And they've looked to Vietnam as a model of how the country has benefited. The Malaysian consortium of mid-tier companies have pushed for the ratification, noting that it would create a more level playing field for Malaysian businesses in regional markets and increase international market access for Malaysian firms. The Malay Vehicle Importers and Traders Association of Malaysia has also asked for this to be ratified because they believe it would revitalize the automotive industry in the country. And I think having delayed the ratification for a period of time, I think the International Trade and Industry Minister Azmin Ali had said that had actually put a timeline to it, saying that the government expects to ratify the CPTPP by mid-2022 after it finalized its cost-benefit analysis for the partnership, which I believe was completed at the end of last year. It remains unclear when Brunei will join in, but definitely I think it would be good for them to do so in terms of encouraging the country to diversify its economy, which has traditionally depended on oil and gas to supply about 60% of its GDP. And then when we look to expanding membership towards the rest of ASEAN, I think Thailand, Indonesia, Philippines have all expressed interest in joining, although Thailand seems the most likely of the three to join at this stage. But then there could, I think what is holding them back from joining could be, for instance, the high entry requirements, ensuring that the legislation is on par with the other CPTPP economies, issues like competition, or of course, with the US focus on worker-centric policies, I think, sometimes labor issues would be problematic as well for ASEAN countries to participate. Of course, Malaysia also had government procurement concerns as part of why they were not able to ratify. There's also some talk of, maybe RCEP, having joined RCEP already, is there still a need to participate in CPTPP? And I think, the withdrawal from the US from the agreement definitely made it less attractive to ASEAN, especially for countries which did not have any bilateral trade agreements with the US, which basically means all of ASEAN except Singapore. And Wendy also talked about how Singapore chaired the first senior officials meeting for 2022 that took place 5 days ago on 18 February. And I think, beyond the implementation of the agreement and, reviewing some of the ideas and new areas for collaboration, I think what was interesting to note too is how they exchange views on accession applications from aspiring economies, and the accession working group for UK's accession to the CPTPP was convened by Japan, and the working group reached the consensus to move to the next phase of market access negotiations, and had advised the United Kingdom to submit market access offers and non-conforming measures to the working group by 20th March. So I never thought I'd see the day that the UK would come closer to the CPTPP compared to the US, and the other thing to note too is, China had formally submitted a request to accede to the agreement in September 2021. And I think that the US should be monitoring this very closely. Orit mentioned the IPAF, is that I think that's what you referred it as for the acronym. And, I think looking at how, it's supposed to see Southeast Asia as central to the regional architecture, I strongly believe that the CPTPP needs to be in the IPAF. When we look at the Indo-Pacific strategy that was released earlier this month, the objectives of advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific, building connections within and beyond the region, driving regional prosperity, bolstering Indo-Pacific security. I believe that all of that can be achieved through rejoining the CPTPP. But I also understand that, advancing what might be a bold proposal on trade might be a bit more challenging right now at this stage, given the domestic US situation. But I do agree with what Sarah mentioned in her paper, that the US needs to rejoin the CPTPP sooner rather than later. But the question is how. And so happy to take questions, and happy to hear what others have to say on this as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nidia. I think now, the kind of flows seamlessly into some questions. And I know you alluded to some of the tension in the area between the various kind of efforts. So let me throw out a question to all three of you right now is, how do you really see the competition between CPTPP's commitments and other efforts like RCEP or IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework? Are these all these various agreements, are they actually in competition with one another for the same interests, or can they actually kind of work together by supplementing each other, and do each have a focus? I think that would be interesting thing because there is overlap, but where do you see there being constructive overlap versus actual overlap with tension?
Maybe I can start the discussion on that excellent question. I mean, from my perspective, all of these initiatives are complementary, right? They don't conflict with each other. They have different objectives. And I think they can all coexist in the region. So that would be like my high level answer to that question. Now, RCEP clearly lower standards, but broader membership. And it was pointed out by the previous speaker that, you know, a number of ASEANs, they look at CPTPP and they just think the bar is so high that they're not sure, even if they're interested in joining, whether they could, you know, actually qualify and be accepted by the other members. So RCEP then becomes, you know, an easier vehicle. I think this tension between high standards and broad membership is one that the United States is facing now as they're cobbling together the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's the same kind of debate I had through my whole career at USTR. You know, on one hand, you want really high standards. You want to push those countries to do as much as possible. And even if that means at times having fewer members, the idea being that if enough countries join a high standards agreement, others then will feel the urge and the pressure, if they want to be competitive, to then reach that standard. And that's, you know, in kind of the different philosophy is if you use a lower standard, you invite more countries, over time, you can improve the agreement and lift the standards. And I think that latter philosophy is one that ASEAN countries use and apply more in their agreements. So I expect RCEP over time to lift its standards, which I think will be positive and again, will be complementary with CPTPP. Now, I also will say, I think there is competition between these initiatives. I think there always was. I think when RCEP was being negotiated, many RCEP negotiators were looking over their shoulders to see how quick the CPTPP was moving. And at one point, I think after the US left the CPTPP, some RCEP members felt, great, pressure's off us, we don't need to negotiate. But then they turned around, I think, given a lot of the concerns about emerging protectionism in the world, that it was in their interest to go ahead and to do this agreement and to show the others that, you know, that the region can open up to each other and integrate. I think the challenge for the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework will be, let's just say there'll be unspoken competition with China's application to join the CPTPP. And which initiative really wins the hearts and minds of the region. Now, they're different initiatives, I get it, but I think we should just put that on the table, that I think there will be competition there. I think some ASEAN countries who have been approached are already asking whether China will even be invited into the IPEF. And, you know, wanting a more inclusive agreement, not wanting an agreement that somehow makes them choose between the United States and China. And I would just conclude and say, I think the administration has been very sensitive to that last point. I think that they have, at least talking to date, and the preparations they're making and the details they're putting in, the discussions for developing the details for this initiative, they're portraying this, and it will come out as a very affirmative agenda. It's not going to be an anti-China agenda. It will be an agenda about addressing the pressing and emerging issues in the region where collective action and collective efforts are needed.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm just going to comment as well. I agree that I think they're mostly supportive of each other, but also somewhat competitive. I do think, I mean, there are a couple of fundamental differences, obviously. I mean, one big difference between IPEF and both RCEP and CPTPP is that there are not going to be any tariff concessions at all, market access provisions in IPEF. So I think it's very fundamentally different in that way. It's really mostly going to focus on digital standards, worker standards, environmental standards, supply chain resiliency. So I think in a lot of ways, other than it's just a fundamentally different type of agreement than the classic kind of market access, market opening type of agreement. So hopefully, I anticipate that a lot of countries will be able to be members of certainly CPTPP and IPEF. I think it is going to be a much higher standard agreement, which, I think is going to be challenging. But I think it's also going to be very unique in that it will be the only agreement at this point with the US in it. So I think that also will kind of have a little bit of a competitive element, certainly with RCEP. And I think it's going to be, the goal is sort of making it a US centered, kind of US focused agreement in Asia. Ostensibly in a way what TPP was going to be until we dropped out. And obviously now the US is looking to re-engage in Asia and is taking a very different approach. So.
Pardon me for interrupting, but all right, you said something very interesting there, which is that you think that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as you said, it's going to be a stronger agreement than.
Well, it's going to be different. I'm saying in terms of the issues that it touches, like digital, labor standards, environmental standards, those will be much higher standards than in any of the agreements. It's not going to be the same type of market access agreement. So I think, and at this point, doesn't look like it'll be a traditional trade agreement in that it won't pass Congress either. So, will be less enforceable in a lot of ways. So very, very different, but certainly putting some much higher standards out there.
Interesting. Nydia, let's turn to you for your thoughts on the competitive effects of these, various initiatives and all covering the same region.
Thank you. I'm not sure how much more I can add beyond what Wendy and Orit had mentioned. I think that, definitely there's enough room for CPTPP, RCEP, and IPEF. I think they all serve, their purpose for the context at that time, right? Looking at RCEP, definitely the standards are lower compared to CPTPP. Broader membership, yes, but also very diverse one. You have developed economies, but you also have least developed ones like Cambodia, Laos, and obviously RCEP has to be a type of lowest common denominator, low-hanging fruit for these countries to be able to participate. And, of course, over time, hopefully with, capacity development and, all sorts of other assistance, that's when, we can slowly bring ASEAN up. I think those ASEAN members up, ASEAN is also looking at a digital economy agreement. They are currently looking to implement a study and then start negotiating by 2025. So that hopefully is also going to help move them along as they look towards, all these digital standards and that Orit had mentioned as well. So I think I will just pause there and have you go on to your next question.
Sure. I'm going to actually ask the audience, feel free to ask anything. We have a Q&A. So if you toggle below, feel free to, add in your question because we want a dynamic discussion here. I'm going to throw a ringer of a question to everybody. Given the fact that CPTPP is now effectively, 4.5 years old, with not more members signing on, is it dead or does it have life going forward? What are your thoughts on it? Because there are other agreements that are now, becoming more actively negotiated.
Well, my view is there's a lot of momentum now with respect to interest in CPTPP membership. You're correct that over the first 4.5 years, there wasn't any formal expression of interest by any countries. Thailand got the closest, but they never really could, get over that bar and make an official application. But now I think we have 4 economies in the queue. I think Nydia said something good. I don't know why I'm saying we. Let me just say there are 4 economies in the queue. The UK, which has where formal accession negotiations have begun with the establishment of a working group last year. And as Nydia mentioned, there was just a meeting of this working group where they agreed to move to the next stage of negotiating market access offers. So my sense is that accession negotiation is going well, is going smoothly. However, based on my experience, there's still going to be hurdles in that negotiation. There'll be difficulties, but I would think that some kind of agreement could be reached by the end of this year. And then we have China's application. Taiwan has applied, Ecuador has applied, and Korea has strongly indicated that after its presidential election, perhaps in April, that it will make a formal application. And that to me just really suggests that maybe it took a while, but there is a lot of interest in this agreement. And then, we also have, there's Malaysia, Brunei, and Chile that still need to ratify the agreement. Perhaps they'll then move forward. Nydia mentioned that Malaysia is seriously looking at ratifying. My personal sense is China would be very happy if Malaysia ratified, because I think China views Malaysia as a strong advocate for China's accession to the CPTPP. So I think a lot's going on. I think all these accessions, on one hand, I'm sure the CPTPP members welcome them. On the other hand, I think all of these accessions really raise some challenging questions and frankly, geopolitical questions for the CPTPP members as they move forward. And I think the safest course for them now is to hunker down, focus on the UK accession negotiations. And since it's the first accession negotiation, it's important that they get it right before starting other accession negotiations. My personal view is it would be good to first focus on the UK and then look at all the other applications and try and figure out the best way to proceed and to consider them.
Yeah, I can't add anything to what Wendy said. So I will also just mention that there is a question in the chat.
Yeah, and I was about to reference that question because it flows seamlessly into this. The question is going to Wendy's comment about how U.S. exporters are increasingly disadvantaged by preferences offered to signatory countries via agreements like the CPTPP and FTAs. What would be the impetus or the trigger for the U.S. to consider pursuing a more liberalizing arrangement? Is it something like the Trade Promotion Authority, or like you just alluded to, the UK joining CPTPP? Do you think the US would be incentivized to come back into the fold should the UK actually ratify? I'll throw that out to everybody, whoever wants to.
I will just take a crack. I think at this point, just politically, it's very, very challenging for the US, which is why they're really taking this IPEF approach. I mean, we don't have TPA, as was noted. I don't think we're going to get a Trade Promotion Authority. I don't think we're going to get that anytime soon. Congress has a lot on its agenda over the next few months. And then there's an election in November. And negotiating a TPA agreement, an agreement on TPA authorization is going to be is going to be a challenging process given where the Congress is. So I think that I don't see us joining a tariff reducing agreement in the region or launching one, certainly in the near future. I think it's also important to mention that from the US perspective, tariffs are actually, fairly low at this point. And so for us, I think, what we lost in TPP was more than anything, kind of a geopolitical connection to the region, more than specific trade commitments. And I think that's what the US is hoping to reclaim with IPEF. And that's why it's also focusing more on standards. Now, how that ends up, whether that ends up achieving the goal, I think time will tell.
Just one point of issue with our REIT. I think it's true tariffs are low among certain CPTP countries and the US, but you look at a Vietnam and look at their high tariffs, we're losing out. And the other countries are now, experiencing, again, I think it's their 5th or 6th year of tariff cuts. We become less and less competitive. And if other, some of these other applicants join, it could continue to put us in a disadvantage. But overall, I agree with what our REIT said. I can't think of a trigger. For me, I thought maybe China saying it wanted to join would really kind of be kind of a wake-up call and lead people to really rethink our strategy. But again, I think efforts now are being put into making the IPEF as relevant, as bold, and as meaningful as possible. And we'll see when it's unfolded whether it kind of has that type of wow factor that the region is looking for.
Yeah, not to be a downer on this situation, but just, noting, how, US exporters are feeling increasingly disadvantaged. I feel like the US is in a little bit of a lose-lose situation because having, as we look at more countries joining CPTPP and as there's more discussion about the benefits of this agreement, if so long as the US is not going to be a part of it, their companies, their exporters are going to be disadvantaged. Then that would lead to a whole discussion about how trade is bad or CPTPP is not good for the US. But then you turn it the other way around and CPTPP is still not good for the US, even as it joins. So I feel like it's really in a difficult position domestically. I think how Congress is configured right now is very different from when TPA was initially passed in 2015. And we were all rooting for the 28 dams that would support TPA, and we had no concerns whatsoever about the Republican side of things. But then now the situation is so different. And yeah, so I feel like IPEF needs to be really, really convincing. And I'm not sure that we are at that stage yet.
Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify my comments in that I don't think it was a good idea to drop out of TPP. And I do think it would be great if the US did join CPTPP. I just, and I do think ultimately they are losing. I just think that is not in the cards. And we're not losing, I take your point, Wendy, but I think we're not losing enough at this point to change the political dynamics. I mean, maybe at some point in the future, that will change if, CPTPP really enlarges and, 10 years from now, all the phase-ins occur and the US is at a serious disadvantage. maybe that will change the dynamics. But, as of this point, I don't think, that I can't see anything that is going to change the dynamics in the near future.
And just to add to this discussion, and I alluded to this in my opening remarks, that even if, and it's a big if the US were interested in rejoining, the current CPTPP as written, it would need to be revised. It would need to be updated. There are areas like, the e-commerce chapter, which would need to be updated. You look at the environment chapter and, the climate provisions. There are also additions and novel provisions that were added to the USMCA. I'm sure that there's some in the US that would feel that they would very much belong in any regional Asian agreement. And finally, there are provisions where I think we pressed for at one point when I was a member of the US delegation, where now I question whether we would even put them on our wish list. And here I would include investor-state dispute settlement. I'm not convinced that would be important to the United States anymore. And frankly, I even wonder if investment protections provided in the agreement would be of interest to the United States. And, also issues like, data protection for biologics that didn't find its way into the USMCA. A lot of businesses and some Congress folks were very careful in saying this wasn't a precedent. It was a one-off, but unclear to me, given where the debate is on healthcare in the United States, whether that's something we would be fighting for. So again, it's very simplistic to say, should we rejoin or not? I think, if you think the agreement itself the initial agreement, TPP, was signed in 2015. That's now 6.5 years ago, October of 2015. But many of the proposals that wound up in the agreement are 10 years old or even more. So there's a lot of work that would, need to occur. And I would also just advocate, if we were to rejoin, we'd really need to rename it with some new name that would be easier to say and would just roll off our tongues more easily.
So, yeah, that is very true. This is a tongue twister. One of the interesting things that seems to be a refrain in our discussion is China. And China is, however we look at it, it is a behemoth when it comes to trade. And with the strong backlash against, Chinese trade practices, etc. How do you see things like the China's One Belt, One Road, or now the revised, newly named Belt and Road Initiative? How do you see that interplaying with CPTPP or its successor, and with a better name?
I mean, personally, I don't know what Wendy thinks. I don't know. I'm a little skeptical of China's ability to join CPTPP. I know they've announced their intention, but I think I have a lot of doubt as to whether they could actually meet the commitments needed to join. And, and I think, even though, as Wendy said, IPEF is going to be launched as a positive initiative, I think the unspoken in there is that it is a little bit of a bulwark against China. In other words, by putting high standards out there, we are in essence, offering an alternative to the low standards that China is pursuing. Specifically, certainly in the digital sphere, China has been putting out their very autocratic standards, and something the US, wants to take a very firm stand on. But even across the other areas, their worker standards, China has a very serious issue with forced labor in Xinjiang, environmental standards, they're exporting coal fire plants around the region, even their infrastructure standards through Belt and Road, are open the door to corruption and other things. So I think the US is consciously putting out there a high standard agreement that is to give countries an alternative to the China model, even if it's not explicitly laid out in that way.
Nydia, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, I definitely do agree that I think China would have some difficulties in terms of joining the CPTPP. If you look at what they've agreed to in terms of RCEP, already that was a bit of a stretch, and there were some issues with some of the chapters, and of course with market access. I think, when you look at One Belt, One Road or RCEP, and you look at CPTPP, definitely there is a difference in terms of standards, but it's also, looking at what countries can agree to at this point in time. And the concern is that, ASEAN countries would naturally gravitate towards what would be easier or what is within reach for them at this point in time. So how do we then go about ensuring that all countries move along or get up to the higher standards? Is it some kind of a stepping stone where countries join RCEP and then they join CPTPP? I don't think that any CPTPP ASEAN member would ever, say choose one or the other, but I think, there's definitely, I think IPEF would also need to then consider how we can help these ASEAN member states that might be further along, that are least developed economies, how we can look towards bringing them all up to speed so that, standards can be lifted as a whole.
I can just add, I think, the other CPTPP countries over time are going to be hard pressed to keep China out of the negotiations for CPTPP accession. Now you've already seen, there's a bit of a split between what countries are saying about China's accession. Let's remember, China's the largest trading partner for most of the CPTPP countries. They're relying on the Chinese market for exports, for growth, for supply chains, for innovation. And China has a lot of influence over a lot of their neighboring countries. And so over time, I think if folks in the United States are thinking this is never going to happen, then they're not reading the tea leaves correctly. I mean, in my mind, I think a working party eventually will be established. I think the one wild card there will be maybe, if China just shoots itself in the foot by taking Australia type of actions, trade coercive actions against other CPTPP members. That could be one way where they kind of, they can become their own worst enemy here. But for a number of CPTPP countries, they're already looking at a potential Chinese accession in the lens of the WTO accession, thinking that this could lead to further reform, further market opening. What do we have to lose by starting these negotiations? My personal view is once you start the negotiations and establish a working group with a party as big as China, it's going to be hard to kind of turn it off, even if it means giving them certain exceptions, exclusions, having certain footnotes in the agreement, kind of, giving them a break or long transition periods. So I think this is something everyone needs to take very seriously. And I just think that with time, CPTPP countries are going to find it very difficult to block the establishment of a working group for China.
So I think we have about 5 minutes left in the session, and I think we have a couple of more questions. So I'm going to throw out the question here, which is a participant, an audience member has asked, USMCA seems to have achieved, measures where they have strong bipartisan support with stronger labor and environmental standards. Do you think the CPTPP countries should be looking for maybe, trilateral agreements that, such as USMCA for improvements, or do you see kind of a larger multi-nation agreement really being feasible going forward to address some of these labor issues?
You know,
Mhm,
oh,
sorry.
go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think, Singapore is definitely looking towards the USMCA. I think, especially as it relates to the chapters on digital trade, and I think Singapore would want nothing more than to just plunk over the digital chapter to have a bilateral US Singapore digital economy agreement. So I think that, countries are already looking towards the USMCA, but we need to also be very careful about what we are looking at. I know Wendy said that she doesn't think ISDS is important, but I think, it definitely does serve its purpose, especially especially as assurance for countries who are looking to invest in developing economies.
So I would just add, I think, Nidhi, you're getting to this. I mean, USMCA is a schizophrenic agreement, right? Because there's a lot of provisions that kind of build on the CPTPP in the good sense. They're trade liberalizing, they're recognizing the developments in technology. But then there are other provisions, which I'm sure our CPTPP trading partners probably would have second thoughts about embracing, including very strict rules of origin for autos, including the non-market economy provision, including currency manipulation provision, and maybe some of the government procurement provisions. So again, when we talk about the USMCA, we need to figure out which part of the agreement we're talking about. Look, with the USMCA, I mean, what an accomplishment for the administration and Congress in terms of passing a bill to approve a trade agreement with such a resounding, bipartisan support. And so we should look to that agreement as we think about how to engage in the region. At the same time, I would just caution everyone to keep in mind that the US had enormous leverage with Mexico in particular, but also with Canada, where 75% of their exports go to the US. I mean, that gives us enormous leverage in a trade negotiation. We walk away, and where are their exports going? When we look at our CPTPP partners, those are not the trade patterns. In fact, those countries, if anything, are becoming less and less dependent on us. Also, in the USMCA negotiations, let's remember the trade-off was not only no USMCA if you voted against it, but it was going to be no NAFTA if you voted against it. So you'd be going back 20 years and have to unwind a lot of the trade and business relationships and supply chains that had been developed. So I think we all need to be realistic. Number one, when we talk about how the USMCA, what lessons to be learned from the USMCA vote. But again, I think that there are provisions in there, including some of the novel provisions that we need to seriously look at and see whether they apply or could be adjusted to make them more palatable for our Asian Pacific partners in the CPTPP.
Yeah, I agree, Wendy, and I think for all the reasons she mentioned and more, having that kind of an agreement in Asia at this point is just not on the cards. So,
well, thank you very much to all three of you. It's been a fantastic panel. We're just at the hour, and you've given us a lot to think about, and also to look and monitor what's happening out there, so that we are fully apprised about all of these various issues. Lisa, would you like to say any concluding remarks?
Thank you, Nydia. And I'm just going to add my thanks. Wendy, Arit, Nydia, you guys were fantastic. This was such an insightful and informative panel. And of course, inspired by our own Sarah Salinas, who I know is going to be a very active member of the WIC community now going forward. We can't thank you guys enough. And it really demonstrates just the breadth of insights we get from throughout the WIC community. I did put it in the chat too, reminder to all of our participants, if you have family, friends, you're a student yourself, the WIT scholarship program is a semester-based program. A lot of information on our website, not only about how to apply for the scholarship, previous winners, but also opportunities to get more engaged in WIT. We'd encourage you to do that and be a part of our next incredibly impactful discussion. But in the meantime, thank you so much to Sarah for inspiring us. And Nydia, Wendy, Ori, thanks for being so willing to share your incredible insights and analysis. Thanks to all for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.